and good evening. You're watching the Conscious Communication Tuesday night theory session, and tonight actually we're presenting a new lens, the CHAORDIC lens, which is the third from the left hand side, and we'll be looking at that from the point of view of work mainly today, focusing on work communication, online and offline. And the question we'll be answering is how to actually balance the chaos and the order in a process of communication, small process like meeting, conversation, or bigger process like design thinking. And we'll be looking at that from a theoretical angle today, and we'll be looking also at a couple of examples of processes and how that fits to those processes. Good evening, Aspen River. Good evening, Eero. Please fire the questions as usual into the chat. I will pick them up as we go along, just as usual. So, CHAORDIC lens. Before I go into that lens itself, the CHAORDIC lens is a very unusual name. Often when people see that name the first time, they think I'm talking about the chaos theory. So this is not at all the same. If you've read about the chaos theory, this is a very different theory that comes from the world of social sciences, and it was coined by Owen Harrison and also others like D. Hock, who was working on the organizational transformation of the Visa Corporation. And he spent many years looking at how to transform the organizational culture and wrote a book called The Birth of the CHAORDIC Age, which is a highly recommendable book. Even though it's actually now over 2 decades old, it's actually still very, very relevant today. So let's jump into the actual theory itself. And I'll take my blackboard this time with a blue pen, because we're going to use the metaphor of water to clarify what this means. If you're designing a process, whether it's just a conversation where you're trying to get something out of it, like a brainstorm, for example, or whether you're designing a bigger process of change, like a 3-4 month transformation project in an organization, you basically have 4 different configurations that a group can find itself in. Groups of people can be, and I'm going to draw this as a vertical line, they can be anywhere on this gradient, and 4 possible states. There can be a state of chaos. If you've been in a badly run brainstorm and you see everybody shouting over each other, or a French meeting, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about with chaos. Chaos is when it seems that nothing is ordered and conversations are going in all directions, people are interrupting each other. That's a very common situation. So I'm sure you've experienced chaos. There's also a state of kamos, which is actually a Greek term that refers to the destructive side of chaos. So you could see chaos as actually a positive. If we're taking the Greek etymology, chaos is positive, kamos is negative. Okay, and I'm going to metaphorically say that this is like a cloud. If we take the water metaphor, this is explosion, where the cloud dissipates into the bigger sky. And here we're talking about the state of order, where we think of it as liquid. So order then leads to, if you go further down the line, control. So a group of people, no matter how big or small, can be permanently fluctuating between these 4 states. So you might have a moment in the meeting or conversation where there's chaos and it slips to order when somebody comes in with an agenda. And then it can get very controlled if you're in a procedural environment with highly structured conversations, for example. You can then go further down towards control. Now, what's important is that when you look at social science that has been studying these states, it's interesting to note that if you go too far in either end of the scale, you destroy the group dynamics. So if you go too far down towards the control state, you get something called implosion of a group. Implosion. So you'll find this in organizations where there's a very rigid culture and people are not allowed to do anything, basically, and that can lead to depression. It can lead to people going on sick leave, and if they're not able to leave or change the culture, there has been even some companies where this led to suicides. There's been a mediatized case in France a few years back with one of the big companies that actually had exactly this problem where too much control, and then it led to some disastrous effects on the team dynamics. Of course, that's a very extreme example, but in a general daily life, that means to implode as a group means that people withdraw and they're no longer willing to engage in any meaningful conversation at work. On the other side, if you go too far towards gamos, you have the opposite effect. You have explodes. So X as opposed to implodes, it explodes. And this is where people just walk away. If they can, they walk away. They just no longer want to be part of that conversation. You see this, for example, in social gatherings, which are not structured, and where everybody's coming with their own agendas. And if there's no uniting factor and too much chaos, people just fizzle away and walk away. So that's gamos. Now, obviously, this theoretical states are changing all the time. So it's rather difficult for managers and leaders and hosts and facilitators to navigate that. And one of the big findings of D. Hock when he was researching this topic is that you actually can have two paths of balance in this line. If I draw them horizontally, you have this path and you have this path. So when you're trying to find a balance between these different states, the one path that is between order and control is called, very originally, the order control path. It was named by some academics, no doubt. Order control path is very useful if you're trying to get predictable outcomes. Example of that would be air traffic control, heart surgery, Helsinki city transport timetables, trains. You don't want to have too much unknowns in a situation like heart surgery. You want to be very sure that within a given time you're predictably able to replace a person's heart with an electronic device. That has to be in an order and control balance. And so it's also the case with budget controlling, for example, and certain departments and organizations need that balance of order control. But the majority of organizations need to cultivate this, which is, and I'm going to draw this in yellow to highlight it a bit more. This is called the CHAORDIC balance or CHAORDIC path. Very original because it's a balance of chaos and order, CHAORDIC. Okay, so what happens when you find the CHAORDIC path or CHAORDIC balance is that you're going to be getting creative thinking. It's what you need for dialogue. If we followed the actual session I did on the 4 levels of conversation, first being small talk, second being discussion, third being dialogue, fourth being co-creative dialogue, you need a chaotic balance to get to a dialogue or a co-creative dialogue. So you can get creative outcomes. That means, for example, creative problem solving. If you're in an engineering environment where you need to solve some tricky technical situations as a team, you're going to need a chaotic balance in that team dynamic. Also, if you're trying to do brainstorm and you're working in innovation, obviously you're going to need creative outcomes as well. So predictable is the bottom one. When you want predictable outcomes, heart surgery, creative outcomes is the chaotic path. So not all situations benefit from a chaotic balance. A large amount of them, but not all. So how does it work? So far, okay, that's just theory. What we need to look at is a breakdown that is often invisible. That's why I'm going to be using the metaphor of the iceberg, which is probably overused nowadays, but I'll use it nonetheless because it does a good job of explaining this. So if we think of an iceberg, let's see if I can draw an iceberg tonight. There we go. If we think of the iceberg, obviously, you know the iceberg metaphor denotes that there's a hidden part that's bigger and more important. And this is exactly what's happening when you start to consider that there is this dynamic going on the content of a conversation versus the process of a conversation. The process is invisible. Good example of that is if you look at meeting agendas for large conferences. Think of Nordic Business Forum, for example, or Slush. The process and the content are often confused in people's mind because actually all that we're seeing is the content. A content is who's the keynote speaker for next year? What are we going to talk about? What's the question? What are we answering? What are we bringing to the table? What's the topic? All that is content. So the topic, the questions, Now, think of a meeting agenda. You actually would have a meeting agenda often that's only content. It's like, here are the topics that we need to cover today in the meeting, and that's it. It's a bullet list of topics. So that's content in communication. Process is how we engage in those topics. What's the form of conversation that we're having in that topic? So for example, are we doing a brainstorm is different than we're doing a presentation with a keynote. Those are very different processes with different rules of engagement, different ways of communicating and interacting. And those are the process points. Now, what was found by Owen Harrison when he started to study these phenomena in large conferences, and this was back in the 70s, he found that when he was interviewing the people who'd been to all these conferences, he systematically found that they really loved those more chaotic moments of the conference, which are, you know, for example, the networking, the drinks between the two keynote speakers. And there was a systematic pattern about those being more liked, more enjoyed, more useful. So he started to look into it, and he found that actually there is an underlying assumption that people are making, and still today it's incredible how you know that is still unknown in business schools, that we tend to think that to balance chaos and order, we need to put chaos in the process and have order in the content. So what happens is that, you know, the keynote speakers for these big events are locked down 18 months ahead to do the media. So there's absolutely huge amount of order and control ahead of time on the content, and the chaos then slides in to the process. And then he started looking into this. He realized that actually what would happen if we switched around and we started to look at putting order in the actual process and leave a little bit more chaos in the content. And his experiments led him to design a new type of process, which he called a CHAORDIC process. A book you might want to look up is called Open Space Technology by Owen Harrison. It was one of the first books that talks about open space technology in that particular way of a CHAORDIC balance. So what he did is that he had this very fundamental approach to a big event where he said, I'm not going to bring an agenda. I'm just going to bring a process and some rules and a structure that's going to allow people to tackle any topic they want to talk about. And that's how open space technology, which then led to all sorts of other CHAORDIC process, which you might have heard of, like the peer coaching cafe, the World Cafe format. All of those are CHAORDIC processes that were born from that movement. And what they were doing is essentially switching round. And if I put it really simply, you lock, I'm going to draw a little padlock here, you lock the process, you lock order into the process so that you can have creative chaos, the positive chaos in the content of conversations. I'll give you an example. I did this in Alto Design Factory a few years back, where we had about 112, 20 people, all sorts of different entrepreneurs, academics, researchers who were coming together from different countries. And the brief was, let's get them to network and see if we can come up with some new projects and initiatives that would be of interest for everybody. Pretty standard brief for a big university gathering. And so we ran that as an open space from Owen Harrison's methodology. And so what happened is that the beginning of the process was a check-in where we opened up a marketplace of topics. So like a big wall with post-its where people could offer topics that they were interested in. So rather than coming up with a set keynote agenda, it was really self-created and emergent right there. And there was a lot of chaos at first. And you could see at the beginning of the period, the people were a bit like, this is not going to work. And they loved it. And then at the end, you know, by the 4th hour of this event, when we got back to the end, there was about 12 initiatives that had started organically from that creative chaos. So it really works if you play by those structured rules. So how do you do that in practice? Well, first of all, what does process mean in that context? There's a few things that you need to lock down. The first one is that you need to have clear roles. And I don't mean the hierarchical roles of I'm the boss, you're the employee. I'm talking about CHAORDIC roles, which are to do with how you engage in collective intelligence. I'll be releasing next year probably an infographic on that with the basic collective intelligent roles, but essentially it means what? It means either you are a participant, either you are a harvester, or either you are a host. That's the simplest way of looking at it. So a participant is just coming in and talking to people and contributing. And they can contribute, for example, by moving around the groups like a bumblebee, or they can just be active in one group. But those are just participants. You need then other roles which are looking after the collective intelligence, like harvesters looking at gathering the content, and hosts making sure that the process has got enough order and control for things to run smoothly. Without that, it goes to Kamos, and then the whole thing doesn't work. So you need roles, the two being most important, harvester and host. In a minimum way, you can get away with just two people doing that, a harvester and a host, and all the rest participants. But when the group size goes up, if you're more than 5 to 10 people, then you're going to start to need to have a little team of hosts and harvesters that work together and have prepared a process. Then once you've got those roles in place and that everybody understands what role they're taking in that period of time, you also need rules. For example, in open space technology, one of the rules is that if at any one time when you're going to one of the work groups, you are neither learning or contributing, then it is your responsibility to move to the next group. And what that does, that's a very simple rule, but it's beautiful because it allows people to take responsibility for their level of engagement and flow. And they can't outsource it to saying, oh, I was in a boring PowerPoint meeting, I don't want to stay. Well, move. If you're not contributing or learning, move. That's, an example of a rule that creates process fluidity and a chaotic balance. So you need rules. And there's loads of stuff online that you can look up on rules for different types of processes. For example, if you Google brainstorm rules IDEO, you'll find a really great set of rules. If you look at open space, you'll find resources. If you look at World Cafe, you'll find rules for the World Cafe and a printable free worksheet. So there's a lot of things out there now that exist, but people just don't know to look for a chaotic process. And so the third element, which are the sort of really fundamental process blocks, is you need an actual process, which I would call a protocol. A protocol is really just like a timeline of how you're going to run it. And now a protocol will always look roughly like this. There will always be a period that's what we call a divergent period, meaning that you're opening your thinking. There's always going to be a period of floating uncertainty called the groan zone, because people groan when they're in that mostly, the groan zone. And there will also be a period of convergent thinking. And there's a beginning and there's an end. If you want to get people walking away feeling good, there needs to be a psychological feeling of closure at the end. So typically, you can think of any process with that series of steps. Now, what we've been doing over the last years is dissecting all these different processes and analyzing them and looking at them in terms of kind of Lego blocks of process. And at the moment, we've identified about 20 different blocks, which are what we call chaotic process blocks. I think we need to rename them to make them more sexy, but they're basically blocks of process. So one of them might be the check-in. A check-in, before you start anything, you get people to check in, tune their instruments, start thinking together. That's a block. And there are a number of blocks that can be just put together and in different sequences that will generally keep your process chaotic. So that's like the advanced level of chaotic processes. But without needing to use Lego blocks or designing your own process, you can use plenty of ready-made processes that already have proved themselves over years. All you're looking at is that there is a period of open thinking, there's a period of exploration, and there's a period of closure of thinking. So if I think of a Monday meeting where you're trying to make decisions, divergent thinking is open questions. How might we do this? What are the topics of today? The agenda is being set. The groan zone might be where we explore, make decisions, have a dialogue, and the convergence is where we might make decisions, use thumb votings, and start to narrow down to actually plan and allocate tasks for people, for example. That's a very simple way of looking at this 3-step model. So protocols for process is the third aspect that you need. Any questions so far? I'm going quite fast today. Maybe it's the Tuesday night effect. And now, just to recap where we are. chaotic path is not always needed. Sometimes you need very predictable outcomes, like you're doing budget controlling, you need to go through all the Excels, fine. But in most cases, you do want to have creative thinking or fresh thinking, and therefore you would need to balance chaos and order. Chaos comes positively if there is enough order in the process. If by chance you try this out and you switch it round, you'll notice that it very quickly slides in one end of the scale or the other. So don't take my word, try it one day, try a meeting, the same meeting topic, and put the chaos in the process and just turn up with a list of questions. I've seen this so many times in meetings, a whole long list of topics, but no process of how we're going to tackle those questions, no process on rules or decision making, anything like that. And then the next week you try the other way around, where you give a structured process with a check-in, an open share, show and tell, followed by a grown zone exploration with a dialogue, and then a decision making with a thumbs voting, for example. And you leave the content to arrive on the day, and just notice, you can debrief that with your team and notice how those two work differently. You'll probably land to the same conclusion, that chaotic balance is easier to maintain when the order is in the process rather than the content. And that means that you can afford, the degree to which you are putting order in the process is the degree to which you're able to afford open and creative thinking. So in other words, the more you want to go crazy in your thinking, the more you want to go bold and out of the box, blue sky thinking, the more you need structured processes, rules, and roles. And that's quite counterintuitive, particularly if you work in a creative agency where most of the creatives will fundamentally dislike any process. They will resist it quite often. So it's then your job to actually communicate something like this, or simplified version of it, to help them understand why it's important for their creativity to be able to have a particular process. Now, let's connect this to things that are out there on LinkedIn a lot at the moment. In the business world at the moment, if you follow these typical fashionable processes, you'll notice that there is quite a few buzzwords. And these are all actually, without naming the chaotic theory, they actually are working because they are finding a chaotic balance. I'll give you an example. The sprint, design sprint. Jake Knapp is one of the guys who's written a book on this and has a lot of details on how to structure. In fact, the whole book is structuring the process, the rules, the protocols. It's all about that. And it's a 1 week format where you start on a Monday and you work your way through the week, and every set moment of the week is a very clear process. And the content is entirely up to you. It's the chaos. So you can look at it from a point of view of 1 week. You can look at it from the point of view of a month. If you think of a couple of months, then a process that you might have heard of is design thinking. I used to work in a company where they were working with design thinking called IDEO, and design thinking is often expressed in so many ways. I think everybody has a different definition and explanation of design thinking, but one thing to note in design thinking is that it also creates a structured set of roles, rules, and protocols over time. It's just a longer period of time. The aim is to enhance creativity in a user-centered way and promote iterative thinking, things like that, but it's still very structured on the process more than the content. It allows the content to emerge chaotically in a positive way. And so if you look basically at any process that is in the business world, whether it's creative processes, lean service creation, the double design diamond process, all of those are surfing off that same theoretical idea that the more you lock down the order in the process, the more positive creative energy and thinking you get. So how do we now zoom in and apply this into conversations? Because obviously with Green Elephant, we're not advocating the bigger processes, because our field is really conversations and communication. So if we go zooming down to not 1 week or 1 month, but a couple of hours, let's say 1 hour, then you can also use this to design what we would call internally chaotic conversations or meetings. So you can imagine when we're working with customers or people who are not working with chaotic meetings, it's quite tricky because they often put an agenda and an invitation for a meeting which will be a bullet point of topics to cover with no understanding of who's hosting, who's harvesting, what are the rules that we're going to use to make decisions together. All that is left floating. And so it means that when we have, let's imagine that I'm now talking to a new organization that wants to do a Jedi training of 3 months and transform their culture with communication. One of the first things we have to do in these meetings is actually propose to take over the process, because it's quite likely, and we assume often, that they haven't got one. So to be politically correct, I'll say, like, before we even meet, so who is hosting this conversation? What is the purpose? How are we going to run it? And I'm asking those questions up front to avoid having this awkward beginning of a meeting where there's assumptions being made on both sides. And often then that means that we don't waste those 15-20 minutes at the beginning of chit chat and awkward, like who's doing what, but in fact it often leads to one of us proposing a process, because often people don't know this theory, therefore they don't know to propose one. So a typical thing that's worth bearing in mind if you're working a lot online at the moment is to start creating a habit of really paying attention to your invitations. It is not enough to just send a calendar invite with a topic, because essentially you're setting yourself up for too much chaos. So if you can, what's really nice is to have at the beginning of a conversation, if it's even an internal meeting, to have first of all the purpose of why we're gathering. Secondly, I like to add a couple of goals, even if they change during the process. At least there is something. What are we trying to achieve in that 1 hour? Even if it's just, okay, we're going to make decisions about this week. Still, that's a goal. The roles of the participants. This is often forgotten because it feels a little bit difficult, but it's really simple. Even if you don't know people, you can use LinkedIn. And you can make those assumptions. I'm inviting Alan, for example, in his pedagogical capacity. I'm inviting Eero because of his design skills. I'm inviting Mari for her budgeting expertise. Even that is enough, because what you're saying is that they're coming in as expert participants. And if, for example, then I'm inviting Aspen River to be a co-host, I might even voice that in the invitation, and Aspen River will be co-hosting and harvesting this session for us. Thank you. So it's also a way of doing a nice green gesture, empathic gesture towards the participants, and also allowing people to know why the others are turning up and create their own conversations before, during, and after the meeting. And that can make huge amount of synergies happen just by having the roles of those participants. And then rules is a little bit trickier. It's often difficult to put rules before meeting. I like to prepare having 1 or 2 in my pocket. For example, if we're doing decision making, I might bring the thumbs voting. If we're doing a brainstorm, I'll have IDEO's brainstorming rules. If we're having a conflict mediation, I'll bring the non-violent communication rules. But I'm always looking at, based on this process, what are the minimum viable rules that we're going to need to use, and have them ready at the beginning of the process and introduce them so that people can understand before the rules have been broken that they are actually rules for this conversation to go wrong. And that's something that works face-to-face very nicely. So I'll put that in bracket because it's the face-to-face. And so once you've done that invitation, first benefit is that you're not wasting as much time at the beginning of a meeting. Secondly is that it usually means that you finish more likely on time. And perhaps not so much in Scandinavia, but in the Latin cultures, that is one of the most common complaints about meetings, particularly nowadays with the online culture, is, oh my goodness, I'm having Zoom fatigue here. You know that a 1 hour meet is going to overspill to an hour and a half if you want to finish your topic. And that is usually because there is a lack of chaoticness in the process. It's just chaos. So then the loud people speak a lot, the quiet people don't, and it is very difficult to run that meeting. So the other side benefit of having a chaotic process is having, at the start of the meeting, the authority. If you follow the green, blue, red series that we did a couple of weeks back, there is green, blue, and red authority. So authority is not just a singular thing. Your authority is blue, which is your expertise. It's red because of your charisma, and it's green because of your degree of earned trust by the group. So if you're a newcomer, you don't have any green empathy, most likely. So you need to build it. And one way of building it is to be green in the beginning of a meeting by expressing what people are thinking without them saying. You are all here and you're thinking that we're going to overspill the meeting, like it can happen many times. Well, we're not, as long as we have this process and these rules. This is why we're offering these to serve the dynamics of the group to finish on time. Just that sometimes is enough to gain your green authority on the beginning of a meeting as a host. So there we go. Those are the key elements. And how now, when you start looking at all these buzzwords, this literally every week I find new processes being coined. Quite often they're very similar. They're just branded by a new consulting company who's wanting to milk it for what it is, but it's actually a chaotic process. So you can pay attention to what are the roles, I'll put them in yellow, what are the rules and what are the protocols, and it's kind of a cheat sheet for you to understand how chaotic it is. If you notice that a process only has protocols, no roles and no rules, you can expect it to be harder to run. So a good question to ask yourself is if you're taking part in a creative process with people, with lots of stakeholders, for example, is to really, before it starts, be that kind devil's advocate that's asking, what are the roles going to be? Who's going to be doing what? What are the rules that you're proposing first to finish this on time? And what is the process that we're going to follow so that this works? Anybody have a suggestion? And if they don't, then you might be able to actually lead that meeting and gain the authority in that context. So we've now covered how the chaotic theory links to bigger processes. If you have any particular processes that you'd like me to unpack, if I know it, I'd be happy to look at it with the drawing pad. I know that Alan has actually experienced a chaotic process because a couple of years ago, I hope you don't mind me saying this, Alan, but has been working with education and process design. And Alan has actually experienced chaotic processes in the context of gathering information from schools in different countries. So I was wondering if, Alan, you had any particular insights to share about that. Please be my guest. Yeah. No, I was just wondering if you had any particular insights about that. If this rings any bells in terms of the roles, the rules, and the protocols that you were using in that particular educational game that you were working with. Also, I think Mari, you've been actually, without knowing, working towards more order and control with your area of expertise. So one invitation for you there is to think of where can you bring more chaos actually. When you're working with the pragmatic aspects, which aspects need more creative thinking, where can you bring more chaotic balance? So you can use this knowledge to, first of all, establish the authority of how to host a meeting. Secondly, to understand if a process that you're about to start testing that you haven't tested before is going to work or not by looking at roles, rules, and protocols. And also to help you figure out how to navigate any process, because if you look back at this yellow here, you can pretty much expect that this will continue going on. Processes, in fact the double diamond process is this, but over a longer period of time. So you know that there's always going to be this in-breath and out-breath, in-breath and out-breath of thinking in most processes. So if you know that in a particular process you need to leave the time for that, you're not going to be cut short and have to finish a meeting halfway through with people walking away unsatisfied. So Alan is saying introducing roles and rules have worked very well. That's all thanks to the work we started with you. Yeah, thank you, Alan. So the roles and rules, you started to use the roles and the rules very early on. Did you have any particular challenges with introducing both the rules and the roles? Because it is quite tricky sometimes to introduce them. Or any tips that you found of how to do that in the context of educational innovation, for example? That's something we hadn't actually debriefed after that. And it has worked all the way from ministers to neighbors. Cool. Yeah, you did quite a lot of that in Southeast Asia. So now are there any other questions or any other thoughts or exploration topics that we could bring into this? One thing I would like to share with the upcoming 2021, and if our design team allows us to do that, is to share those Lego blocks with you. They're at the moment in beta, so we have them in a Trello board. But these Lego blocks are really an expert tool for people who design processes like facilitators. And the first tests we've done with them are only really valuable when a person is highly aware of chaotic processes. For example, Scrum Masters, professional facilitators, conflict mediators, or people who run a lot of meetings and workshops. And for those people, these chaotic blocks are very, very valuable, because what they do is that they give you how to run each block piece by piece. So for example, if I take one which is almost always being used, it's called the check-in. There's literally dozens of ways to do a check-in. A check-in can be anything from an open question as an icebreaker to a deep flow check-in with 3 different questions on motivation, challenge, and competence to sort of calibrate your work with the team on the day to come. So a check-in is a particular block that you'll find works very nicely with a check-out to give this feeling of ending and beginning. To get people off their phones and focused, a check-in is really good. And so each of these different check-ins will be, over the years, we've been testing different types of check-ins, and we've harvested them into the Trello board and made comments about what works, what doesn't, in what situation to use it. So I think this is the level of knowledge which I would like to be able to share soon. And the hope is that when we share that in an open source way, then people can start contributing their own learnings from these chaotic blocks. So it becomes more live and more widely contributing. So Alan was saying a game where everyone can find them on the map helps to open the talk. The challenge is to find the context that people can relate to immediately. There is no time to introduce too much to people new things. Talking the people's language is important and challenging. Thank you. So I'm assuming these are the insights from having used chaotic processes. Yeah. So what Alan is referring to is visibility, and that's often the forgotten thing with process. Because process is below the line of the water, it's also invisible. So one of the tricks that you can use, which Alan used, is having a game to make it visible. You can also do that in very low res on a flip chart, whiteboard, or with A4s. You know, for example, I've been in workshops where you take each block of process and you put an A4 with a title and a time on it. So it's like 10 minutes check-in, framing 3 minutes, show and tell 12 minutes, 20 minutes of dialogue, 5 minutes this. And then people can see the process, and it brings the habit of looking at process, not just content. Otherwise, they'll just be thinking, when do I get to talk about my expertise? So making the process visible is a very good point, Alan. Thank you. Aspen River saying, I'm reading the book Range. This has a lot of overlap with that. How could a chaotic process be used to get specialists to take their blinders off and open their mind to more broad thinking? Thank you. That's a beautifully deep question. So when you say they're blinders, I'm assuming that you mean that they're kind of in a siloed expertise, looking at just their own expertise and not looking at the other overlapping expertise. So if that's the case, please do correct me if that's not the right assumption. A chaotic process is exactly what would help in this case, because you're taking the spotlight of focus away from their content expertise, because expertise is content. Unless you just happen to have an expert who's expert on process, like a mediator, but most often experts are content focused. So they're looking at the content only, and often they will actually even resist the process because they just want to talk about their topic. So one thing to bring in, which is where the title of this session this evening was, is to appeal to collective intelligence. Most experts like to think of themselves as intelligent, but often they're forgetting that intelligence is superior when it's collective. And unfortunately today, a lot of meetings are just a collection of individual experts intelligent, not connecting. So I had a situation like that in the CERN in Geneva, the nuclear the particle accelerator. And I was there hosting a workshop for them, a training workshop on communication for their funding. And exactly what experts, really deep, world's best experts, super, super smart people, engineers, physicists, researchers, policymakers, they were just all experts in their field, and they were not able to overlap. So I had to literally draw that process at every step and reassure them. It took me every single time of the step a reassurance, meaning being green, talking about what's in their head, to their different expertise. So for example, if the step number one was a brainstorm of what are the best questions to ask ourselves with regards to communication at the EU policy level, most experts are going to go, why is that relevant? So if you don't voice the purpose, the why, at each step, why are we doing this step? What's this process for? What are the rules? How are we going to do it? You always have a devil's advocate in the group that's going to come up and go, why are we doing this? I don't want to do this. I'm an expert on particle physics. I don't want to talk about policy. And that's how you can invite people, is that you can show that by doing a process together, you tap into the collective intelligence, which is by far more interesting than any intelligence on its own. So collective intelligence, I think, is the short answer. And appealing to that collective intelligence will very rarely get people up against you, because who doesn't want to tap into the collective intelligence? You might find some, but... So yeah, any other questions on that? Visibility. I think that's a key thing I'm going to add. Visibility. And at every step in the process, visibility, particularly if it's a process that people are not familiar with. In our work with different organizations, I can name, for example, Futurize, who has very beautiful processes. They have been using formats to get team dynamics before the COVID, where there's a structured way of doing stand-ups and sharing what's going on with each individual. And that process is so familiar that they don't need to explain it, and therefore everybody jumps in. But if you're doing processes for the first time, a new one, don't be afraid of just debriefing. And that's the other thing I'll end with, is after a checkout, people often forget to debrief the process. And that's the key, because there is no perfect process. You'll always make a mistake, and there's always things to learn. So when you see companies who say, we like feedback, we like to debrief, often what they're doing is they're just debriefing content. They had a project X with a client X, and they're debriefing what they learned working with that client, but often it's focused on the content. So my encouragement here is that when you start looking at chaotic processes, schedule a little, even 5-10 minutes is enough. Schedule a little bit of time at the end with the hosting team. So if there's 3 of you hosting, like a host and 2 harvesters, then get together with those 3, have a cup of coffee and debrief what in the process worked, what took more time, what were the rules, what were they, how were they clear, how were they received, where could we improve the framing of this process. Little anecdote, in France, a manager is called a cadre, which is a frame. So it is embedded in the actual semantics of a manager that their job is to put a frame, which means that there is a boundary, which means that there is also a process. So it is semantically understood without people really realizing the implications of that. So when you step out of that boundary of the meeting, that process, then debriefing can bring you a lot. That's how the chaotic blocks that we talked about, those Lego blocks, were created. Is because by systematically debriefing each of those blocks, we start to learn a bit more what works and what doesn't. So that's it for tonight. Unless there's any last questions, I'll happily answer. We'll be now looking at the chaotic processes on Thursday from a very practical level. I haven't yet decided which particular process we're going to be showcasing to you, but we will be on Thursday night demonstrating a chaotic process so that you can see what it works like and how to do that in practice from the beginning to the end. And if any of you in the chat are interested in joining that live, I'd be more than happy to play in the process with you. So I can even, before the session, give you a little bit of guidance on how we could run it so that you can be inside of the process yourself as a co-host or a harvester or even a participant. So all those are possibilities. It's a great opportunity to start learning a little bit and also having a bit of fun. Thank you very much. Good night, and see you on Thursday evening.